A roll call vote is required, and the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Guilty. Mr. Burr, guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Guilty. Mr. Cassidy, guilty. Ms. Collins. Guilty. Ms. Collins, guilty. Mr. Coons. Guilty. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Not guilty. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Not guilty. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Not guilty. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Not guilty. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Guilty. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Guilty. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Ms. Ernst. Not guilty. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Guilty. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Not guilty. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Not guilty. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Not guilty. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Mr. Haggerty. Not guilty. Mr. Haggerty, not guilty. Ms. Hassan. Guilty. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Not guilty. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Guilty. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper. Guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Guilty. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Not guilty. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe.
Not guilty.
Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kelly, guilty. Mr. Kennedy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King.
Guilty.
Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar.
Guilty.
Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford.
Not guilty.
Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy.
Guilty.
Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mr. Lujan.
Guilty.
Mr. Lujan, guilty. Ms. Lummis.
Not guilty.
Ms. Lummis, not guilty. Mr. Manchin.
Guilty.
Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey.
Guilty.
Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. Marshall.
Not guilty.
Mr. Marshall, not guilty. Mr. McConnell.
Not guilty.
Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Mr. Menendez.
Guilty.
Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, guilty. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, guilty. Mr. Padilla.
Guilty.
Mr. Padilla, guilty. Mr. Paul.
Not guilty.
Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Peters.
Guilty.
Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed.
Guilty.
Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch.
Not guilty.
Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Romney.
Guilty.
Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan.
Not guilty.
Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, guilty. Mr. Tuberville.
Not guilty.
Mr. Tuberville, not guilty. Mr. Van Hollen.
Guilty.
Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Mr. Warnock.
Guilty.
Mr. Warnock, guilty. Ms. Warren.
Guilty.
Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young.
Not guilty.
Mr. Young, not guilty. That's why we have these things. Unless you had a script. 57.
Yep.
Nays are 43.
Yep.
The yeas are 57. The nays are 43. Two-thirds of the senators present not having voted guilty. The Senate judges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, upon one article of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and two-thirds of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charge contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby, acquitted of the charge in said article.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I send an order to the desk.
And the clerk will report.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the article against Donald John Trump, adjourn sine die.
And without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned sine die. And
Hi, Emma Reckenberg here. If you like this video, there's a whole lot more to see on Newsmax TV. You can watch for free right here on our YouTube live stream and be the first one here each time our experts break down real news. Just hit that subscribe button, ring the bell icon, and stay with us on America's fastest growing cable news channel, Newsmax TV.